You know, I've been arrested a number of times protesting mountaintop removal or tar sands pipelines. The problem is that the governments are not going to, I mean, it's drawing attention to a foolish activity. We cannot afford to develop the worst, most carbon-intensive fuels like tar sands, where you get much more carbon. It doesn't make sense. We should be developing clean energies. But just drawing attention to that does not stop. The government is not going to let the lights go out. So unless you have some alternative energies, these protests are just not going to be effective. I think after the last few decades of trying to influence our two political parties, I'm convinced that we need a third party. And it's all the more true today where the two parties have moved to the two extremes. I think we need a centrist party. And it's going to be up to young people to make that decision and to support it. But you know, they've proven that they can have a huge impact. The last election, Bernie Sanders almost overtook Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary because young people were out in the streets and were supporting Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders is basically a socialist. You know, you're not, the central United States is not going to go for that. I think that we need a party in which you go back to something like the kind of conventions that were held half a century ago, where you actually have some power in the delegates. You vote for delegates and for a platform, and a difficulty with the third party is that they can be a spoiler, like Ralph Nader in one of the elections. You don't want somebody who's on an ego trip heading the party. The party, the committee controlling the party should actually make a decision well before the election. Does it make sense for the third party candidate to continue to the actual election? It's argued that it's very difficult for a third party candidate to win in the United States. Actually, H. Ross Perot got 20% of the vote, even though he was a little guy, a little Texan who saw Martians on his front yard. But people were so fed up with the other two parties that he was able to get 20%. So you can imagine if you actually had a good candidate, I think a third party candidate can eventually win. But at the beginning, it may be necessary to just elect some representatives. If you even get a few representatives in Congress, you can begin to be the swing vote. And if you have a sensible platform, then I think the public is ready to move away from these two extremes. We get the big noise from the two extremes, but I don't think most of the public is in either one of those extremes. And I don't see us solving the climate problem if we're just oscillating between those two extremes. One thing that we certainly, and I've not tried to define the platform because I think young people should define the platform, but one thing that it needs to have is we need to move to ranked voting. And there are a couple of states that are doing that. And by ranked voting, I mean when you vote, you list your preferences, all of them in order. So if there are 3 candidates, you give your first, second, and third choices. And if nobody gets 50%, then the candidate on your list that you had third will drop off. No, the candidate that got the least number of votes will drop off, and if you voted for that one, then your number 1 choice, if that was your number 1 choice, then your number 2 choice will become your choice. That's ranked voting. I didn't explain it very well, but it's the way in which you get a recount without having to re-vote. So you immediately, if nobody gets 50%, you immediately go to the candidate that gets the most votes when the lowest candidate has been eliminated. That way, third party, the problem with the third party is basically eliminated. But it requires changing the rules or the constitution of individual states, but it is beginning to be understood that that's really a way in which our government in the U.S. could work better. And I have one suggestion for that's backward. Let me go this way. Oh. Oh, okay. This Chief Yellow Smoke, my great-grandparents immigrated to the United States from Denmark and settled in western Iowa at a time when it was still tall grass prairie with a few groves of trees. There was this, and the Omaha Indians were, Native Americans were the principal tribe in that region. And Chief Yellow Smoke befriended my great-grandfather. But then the railroad came through in 1866, and they made a small town. There were almost no people a decade earlier. It was settled very quickly at that time. But he took to gambling at the saloon in Dunlap, and when he demanded his winnings, he was murdered. Somebody hit him in the head and crushed his skull, and he ended up buried on my great-grandfather's property. There's a book recently published by Ed Wilson, the biologist at Harvard University, in which he's arguing on behalf of all the other species on the planet, and he's saying we need to reserve half of the planet for the other species. Well, it's not very realistic, I think, to think that we're going to abandon half of the planet and give it to the other species. But on the other hand, you know, one of the problems that we've shown is that the species get in trouble when they cannot migrate because the climate zones are shifting. And humans are sort of taking over the planet, and that prevents species from migrating to stay within the climate zone that they can survive in. So I would propose, and you know, and also in my book I talk about our mistreatment of the Native Americans. We still have a debt to them. We could have, and I think we should set aside land, north-south strip of land, which would allow for wildlife and other species on the planet to exist, and which could be managed by Native Americans, those who prefer, there are some of them who prefer to maintain some of their customs and lifestyles. And rather than just having individual national parks here and there, I think like the Appalachian Trail all the way along in the East Coast, you should have a zone in the other half of the country which would be useful for preserving species. And I would argue to include that in the platform. But it could be basically funded by donations over a period of time, and it slowly grows over time. Anyway, that would be one of my suggestions, but I think the platform should be decided by young people. But I think we need a party which is based on the principles that our government was founded on and which we've gotten away from. And I think that it's very hard to push the existing parties back. I think it's easier to start over cleanly with a third party. Thanks. So I guess we have time for discussion. Is there a microphone?
Dr. Hansen, you're saying that renewables are intermittent simply because we have conservative people, conservative ideas about how to use existing carbon creating, in other words, the capitalist system. Is that why you don't think we have a future with just renewables? Or is
I'm not quite clear on what your question is.
Well,
could you repeat that?
We're not even using several solar concepts like tidal energy and a few other things, and even groundwater. You know, groundwater is a consistent 50, 55 degrees all year round. And we can heat up our homes with air conditioning. That right now, forced air conditioning is an extremely expensive, wasteful electric user, where this would just be a little pump and you can heat up your homes. Now, solar is the big thing that's moving forward now to eliminate fossil fuels, and that's heating our homes in winter. What I'm saying is, renewables have been used to a lot lower degree of acceptance, and still is to not fully utilized.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of potential in different renewables. As I mentioned, we generate more electricity than we use on my farm. We also have a heat pump, which is a very good, efficient way to take advantage of heat capacity. But we need to let those, But if we just subsidize those, we find that we never get there. You know, the reason that I could afford to put these solar panels on the barn was I got big subsidies from Pennsylvania, and 30% of it paid by the federal government. And as long as only a few percent of the people are doing that, then then it works. But if 100% of the people do that, then you're paying yourself, and so you can't get a subsidy. So rather than doing it by subsidies, we need to make the price of the fossil fuels rise and then let these alternatives compete. And renewables will be part of the story, but may not be all of it. And probably won't be all of it. If you look at the studies, the recent one that came out of MIT, it's very, you know, one problem with renewables, they actually become harder as they become a bigger fraction of your total. It becomes more difficult to integrate them into the system because of their intermittency. So we need to be open-minded and let the alternatives compete. That's why I say every time there's new information, I try to reset my thinking. But I haven't yet found persuasive evidence that renewables are going to do the whole job. In fact, the studies actually suggest that's very difficult. And Germany is trying very hard to prove that you can do 100% renewables, but what they're actually proving, what they seem to be proving, is the opposite. Their electricity prices have, are more than double those in France, and yet their emissions have sort of stabilized, and they've built new coal-fired power plants because they're closing some nuclear plants, and they just can't get all their energy from renewables. So it's, as I say, let them compete, but make the fossil fuels pay their cost to society.
I would like to comment. You're on Long Island, and I'm sure you're well aware that Long Island fought a nuclear power plant, the Shoreham nuclear power plant, and I'm so delighted that they did, because that technology is so dangerous. And for you to say that no one died at Fukushima, I think is a very extreme statement. And 3 Mile Island, and you didn't mention Chernobyl. But we really haven't exhausted these other technologies. And as you said, yes, they do cost more, and you were supplemented with your solar panels. But why not take this carbon tax that you're talking about and use that money to do more R&D? Because there's not been enough attention put towards real clean, because nuclear is not clean. It's extremely dangerous, and you can stop coal power plants, but once you have radiation on the planet, they don't even know what to do with the waste we have now. And I'm really surprised that's your position. Thank you.
Yeah. See, there are so many misconceptions in what you just said. Maybe I'll try to mention a couple of them. So, waste, for example. Nuclear waste is contained in vessels and harms nobody. The waste from fossil fuel burning is killing 10,000 people a day. The waste from solar panels is not negligible. You've got chromium, mercury, cadmium, different toxic elements that are then released when those solar panels are taken down and disassembled in the poorer communities, and maybe even shipped to Africa or shipped to China. Stopped accepting them. They don't want this pollution. So it's not, every source of energy has got problems, and so you need to objectively compare them. And and this idea that we're going to take the money from tax and use that to subsidize or to do some R&D on your favorite idea for what you think everybody should be doing, that is exactly what is killing young people, because there's no way that the public is going to accept a tax on fossil fuels if the money is going to your favorite charity.
Well, it sounds like nuclear is your favorite charity, and I'd rather, and
No,
I said
no.
R&D, not for things that exist already that are creating pollution. For example, we have an ocean, as you mentioned, that's a perpetual motion machine. We have, rivers, and we have tidal, the ebb and flow every single day, and we're not taking advantage of a lot of things that are truly clean. And it's not my favorite pet project, sir. It's ones that would truly be clean and have less impact.
Let the market decide. But see if I have a chart here. I don't see it. Well, Bill Clinton, in his first State of the Union message, said, we're eliminating R&D on nuclear power, which is not needed. And at the same time, the Department of Energy was ready to do a demonstration plant on a fast reactor, which could burn 99% of the energy in the nuclear fuel. The present reactors burn 0.6% of the energy in the fuel. It's a crazy way to do it, but it's the way that Admiral Rickover chose, because he wanted plutonium. They wanted plutonium for weapons, and they wanted a reactor that could fuel submarines, nuclear submarines, and stay underwater for months at a time without having to surface. And so he got his way. The military had the strongest voice. And we turned down, we just didn't do the alternative R&D on things like thorium-fueled molten salt reactors, which the nuclear experts really wanted to do because they wanted to make nuclear power for peaceful purposes, not weapons. But that didn't happen. And then you've got this, you can build nuclear reactors which operate at atmospheric pressure and are inherently safe. And even if you look at the 50-year-old technology, its safety record is actually quite good. How many people have been killed in the United States by nuclear accidents? I think it's 0 with 100 reactors. But that's old technology. I wouldn't build that again. You can do much better than that. But but this should be decided. It shouldn't be forced on the public. If California says we don't want to have nuclear reactors, or if New York says they don't, then fine. But maybe Georgia wants them because they have very little sunshine, very cloudy place. But we need to develop the options, and I think, this is a case of old geezers forcing on young people a solution or a non-solution, which I think is very inappropriate. I understand how the emotions were churned up in the 3 Mile Island era, even though 3 Mile Island did not kill anybody.
Hello, I'd like to say something. I am German. I live in England. We have islands in Papua New Guinea, a whole atoll. We have a game farm in South Africa. I learned English in San Francisco. I'm 53 this year. I'm not a specialist in anything, and I appreciate you are through research in everything. I'm a specialist maybe close to in what the benefits of a vegan diet are for the planet, for our health, and for the animals. That's where I started. But my niece's long-term partner, well, 3 years, she's only 23, he's 10 years older than her. He built the first all-sustainable village city with about 5,000 inhabitants. That's all sustainable in Weinsberg in Germany. That's not far away from Stuttgart, southwest. And they all told him it can't be done, and it works. And we have minus 18 in the winter and up to plus 40 in the summer. It's working. And what I was saying about Fukushima, it's called The Silent Ocean by Ivan McFadden, and he sailed in 2004 from Melbourne all the way up to Osaka, San Francisco, down to LA and back to Melbourne, and the ocean was beautiful, lots of birds, lots of fish, and he did it 10 years later in 1314, and the ocean was silent and dead, and after Fukushima happened, the tsunami, there was rubbish everywhere, and no more fish, no more birds, as I said, and we're seeing it on the conflict islands. We bought them in 2008, and there were plenty of big fish when you were diving. Now the big fish are gone, and the whales and the dolphins are coming so close to shore. It's quite nice for us to see, but the big fish are missing. The tuna is gone, the marlins. And when we arrived there in 2008, there were huge fish lying around. It was fisherman's heaven. These big fish are gone. I mean, pretty much gone. I mean, not visible to the eye anymore as they were. And that happened in a few years. So there is something happening. And in Germany, in '86, I was 20 when Chernobyl happened. We couldn't eat the salad. Everybody was thrown away, the harvests. It does affect people. And there's other older reactors. I mean, Angela Merkel wants to ban nuclear power because it is not safe. So
I think it would be a very wise idea to ban Soviet old nuclear reactors. Would be a very smart thing to do. But now, are you attributing this change in fish to Fukushima? You see, so if our society has become that unscientific, then we're in deep doo-doo. You can measure the products of Fukushima on the coastline of the United States. And it's several orders of magnitude below anything that would have any effect. There are problems in our wildlife in the ocean, that's for sure. But to relate that to Fukushima is completely unscientific. We do have a lot of...
They're living there. They're not measuring there. Here on the east coast of the state. Isn't that what you just said? In the west coast. In England.
Okay, are there other questions? There.
Thank you. It's my understanding that the global food industry is playing the largest role in this issue we're facing. Do you feel that increasing local food production can be a solution?
Global food production? Is that the question?
Well, do you feel that increasing local food production can be a solution?
The food production, the way we do it, does have an impact on climate. As it's very well known, a heavy meat-based diet has a much greater footprint on the planet than a more vegetarian type diet. You know, what is happening, as we continue to phase off of fossil fuels, the United Nations studies their scenarios for the future. The only way they can get the climate to stabilize is to assume that, oh, we're going to have a lot of sucking of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And their principal scheme for doing that is growing crops, which for fuel, burning these biofuels and capturing the CO2. But that then takes away from food production. It's not a very plausible scheme. But there are ways that we can grow food that would actually alleviate the climate problem. One of those ways is fertilizing with rock dust, including when fertilizing to speed up the natural drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide and the deposition of that carbon on the ocean floor as limestone. So there are ways that you can modify food production to make it actually carbon negative. That's something that's being researched now and is, I think, has a lot of potential. Do we have any other people? There's one in the back.
I'll hand it to you, okay?
Hello, good afternoon, sir. As a young person witnessing this discussion right now, there is one question that, a very basic question I think that keeps popping into my head. And that is at what point do we introduce the discussion of restructuring our society, our economy, to generally reduce our consumption of energy in general, our consumption of electricity and external energy inputs? At what point do we promote a locally based economy, local small-scale food production, and in general, maybe a more of a bartering style and relationship with our neighbors? Is this something that you would consider promoting in your discussion of sustainability?
Yes, and I don't think you achieve it by preaching. I think that, we can say, oh, we're wasting energy. But the problem is there are people, the population is still increasing, and it's going to be increasing for a while. The way to address population, by the way, is to have abundant, affordable, clean energy. Because what happens is that if you develop, as countries become wealthier, the women decide they don't want to have so many children. And so the wealthy countries, the fertility rates are actually below the replenishment level. So I think population problem is solvable on the long run if we have abundant, clean energy and affordable energy. But many people say, oh, let's stop buying so much. Let's reduce our, well, the problem is people like to travel. And they're going to do it. So you can personally decide you're not going to do it. But that's not, I'm afraid that's not a global solution. But you can encourage that. And not by preaching, but by economics. So as you put this rising price on carbon, it's going to make travel and consumption more expensive if it's carbon-based. Now, as we phase out fossil fuels, you may want to continue to have an energy fee. If you want to encourage local production, then these fees do that, because then we import food from New Zealand because fossil fuels are so darn cheap that you can do it. But as they become more expensive, that encourages the nearby farms. So there are steps you can take to move in that direction. And also just the fact that the organic farming is healthier. We do have a problem of these factory farms producing food that is not the most nutritious food. So we can move in that direction of supporting the small scale healthy farms, but I just don't think we can do it by preaching. We've got to actually have the economic incentives there. How about what?
Windmills. California, they have windmills all over. You go to South Carolina, that's where it is. That's Queens.
Yeah. The place they have the most windmills actually is in my home state of Iowa, which is getting 30% of its electricity from windmills. That's a real contribution, not the 2% type. But Iowa's also burning a lot of coal to supplement that. So the question is, how do you get to zero carbon? And the way you do, I think, and the realistic studies show, is by letting the alternatives compete. Don't subsidize your favorite, whatever it is, because that's not going to go global. You may get it to, that's the way to do is to allow all the alternatives to compete.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Cause and effect is a scientific principle, correct? I guess I don't have to give an elaboration of that. Well, for example, if the soil is dry and the plants are dying, and then a big storm comes and the rain goes on the soil, and then all of a sudden, days later, there's things that are growing. It's the effect of the cause, which was that the rain came, and now there's plants growing. Well, there's sharp rises. There are many studies that have been published about after a nuclear accident, a sharp rise in cancers in the areas around the nuclear power plants. Shoreham had a crack in its foundation, and at that time, there was a sharp rise of breast cancer in Long Island, which is why the residents of that area organized and to have it shut down, because there was that correlation. There's someone in my neighborhood, and a neighbor of mine who's from Japan, and she just went to visit her family with her children. And I said, how is it over there? How is the health of the people? Do you hear anything about what's going on? Because I'm thinking about Fukushima. She said, well, there is a problem. There's an epidemic of children with thyroid cancer. And I thought, well, when would there ever be an epidemic of children with thyroid cancer? I said, how do you know about this? She said, it's in the news every night. They're showing children, they're dying from thyroid cancer. I said, well, did they talk about what it's from? I said, do they mention Fukushima? She said, no, we're not allowed to even say the word Fukushima. The media is forbidden to discuss Fukushima. They're supposed to deal with it as if it never happened. I said, well, what are they saying it's from? She said, they're saying it's from the heat. There's too much heat, and that's why the children are dying. And there are studies wherever there was a nuclear power plant release that indicate rises of cancer. So that's the cause and effect, and I don't think that's necessarily unscientific. The problem with radioactivity is that you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, and you really can't feel it. That doesn't mean it's not there. We know it's there because we're utilizing it as an energy source. There's something there that we're utilizing. And it has a half-life, it destroys cellular membranes and causes free radicals, and it's very destructive and takes long, long time to dissipate. So I think it's something to consider as a threat for all of us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to say this and for discussing this with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.